UbuCon Korea, and welcome to Open Source. My name is Yanks, you can call me Yanks. And this is Michael.
Yes, my name is Michael, or Michael Jäger in German. I'm based in Munich, Germany, and I work as a product manager at Canonical. Happy to be here, and we have...
I'm currently working as a software engineer at Canonical. I'm not based in Korea, I'm based in Hong Kong, but I am Korean, so 반갑습니다. I hope you guys are not too hungry. Hi, Michael. You're in Korea for your family trip, right? Have you been having like all these good like Korean food, BBQ, samgyeopsal, and like my favorite soju with 맥주? These are like the Korean culture that you have to experience, in my opinion. Yeah, how's your trip going so far?
My trip is going great so far. So the reason why I travel to Korea is tourism, right? And it's not quite tourism. I have a couple of cousins in Korea. So I was visiting my cousins in Korea, and we obviously had some great dinners together and enjoying great Korean food and also Korean drinks, of course. One thing from the slide you see here was actually the shot from the actual dinner we had, galbi. And it was actually quite good. The thing is that I find remarkable about having dinner in Korea is opposed to having dinner in Europe or in Germany. In Germany or in Europe, everyone orders a plate or a dish for himself, right? I order pizza, someone else orders pasta, the third one orders lasagna, and you have separate dishes on the table. In Korea, you join the dinner together. You share the main dish all together, and everyone can taste everything what is on the table, right? Of course, there's some etiquette, but I find it remarkable that we see some great attitude of we culture in the way of having Korean dinners. And if you look into the web, actually for the next slide, you even find this as an expression of etiquette, as an official etiquette of Korean dinner behavior, right? This is a reference of the Michelin guide, which shows that this is actually the official way of having dinner. It's not really the way of having dinner with cousins, right? With the family. That's the way of having dinner in Korea, opposed to table etiquette in Europe. Great we culture. When being at dinner, you can even experience some other notable thing. You don't serve yourself the drinks, right? In Europe, it's pretty normal to serve yourself the drinks, but in Korea, it's actually impolite if you take the bottle and put your soju in, right? You serve each other, which is another great attitude of we culture we see in Korea. And of course, I didn't enjoy much somek because my cousins and we have family and little kids, right? So it wasn't really the time for drinking, but we enjoyed the great food actually with our children.
It's interesting that you mentioned our children, because in Korean we also say our son. My mom calls me 우리 아들. Yeah, so how did you pick that up?
Yeah, actually, when I was younger, obviously I have a Korean mother. I learned Korean in a weekend school. And one thing I found remarkable as well about the Korean language is that we is the preferred word of expressing where you would say in German or in English, I or my, right? We don't talk about my daughter in Korean or my son or my father or my family or my house. You don't just do that. It sounds awkward. And in Germany, it's pretty normal. You say like, my son is going to school now or something like that. In Korea, you would obviously say our son. I find that very remarkable also as a sign of we culture in Korea. That is a big difference to German culture or to European culture, right? And also, we have put a reference here, an official reference. If you're interested in how foreigners perceive that, here's a reference actually from the BBC travel article, where this is also explained from a foreigner's perspective. And so we feel when we look at open source from an outside perspective of open source in Korea, I think we see some great efforts because the we culture that is very apparent in Korea seems to be a great fit also for the open source culture, right? because it's essentially the same basic idea. Here, if you think about open source, what kind of like keeps on driving the open source is the idea that if you have something what you like, it's even more joy if you share what you like, right? You don't enjoy what you like alone. You enjoy it more if you can share it. You have that kind of like geeky mantra about while you're sharing the value increments, which you see on many open source advocating slides nowadays. But we think the idea is also can be found from an outside perspective very centrally in Korea. And so what does that mean? If you look at open source in Korea, actually we can research the web and we find a number of very impressive Korean initiatives, like the COSA. If you I researched a little bit about COSA KR, and we found that it was founded in 2006 already, and it was actually created based on a preceding organization, the Linux Special Interest Organization, back in 1997, right? So back in 1997, try to think back, how many people had Linux in 97? How many people worked on open source in 97, right? It seems like open source met some enthusiasts of V culture quite early in Korea. And you see great resources in the internet. You have the Open Source Learning Center. And web pages are great, but how does actually Korean open source activities, how do they do by numbers? So I have put here a table from some research, which you also can access publicly. The link is down there. And this research tells you the following. How many people per, let's say, 1 million citizens in a country contribute to open source? It's a relative measure. It doesn't really mean that big countries are higher ranked than small countries. It's a relative measure. And this research tried to understand how the situation was in 2008. You can see like the relative measure of open source contributors in a country per capita was for Korea in a way that they ranked 25 in 2008. And they made a massive jump. Korea made a massive jump until 21, where it was jumping up to rank 11. So that's impressive because all the other countries obviously also did a lot of IT, and all the other countries also did a lot of open source activities, but in relation to it, you see a huge jump of open source activities in Korea. And that's why we think open source is a great match with the Korean V culture that we also observe as someone from outside in the Korean daily life. And Korean daily life for developers, how do you perceive it actually?
Right. Well, why did I first start open source? Well, this was before I joined open source. But this is me now. So I have a cool contribution graph. I was working back then, but then private repositories and stuff. And also, who doesn't like free stuff, right? Not only is like GitHub Actions free, but you have a platform where you can distribute your code, also upload your artifacts, and have it hosted anywhere without your compute. That is an impressive thing that we have done as open source communities. Thank you, Microsoft. And also, it has never been easier to share ideas than ever before. And to be fair, open source experience is quite unique. You have to talk to a lot of different people from a lot of different regions with a lot of different ideas. But in the end, like you go through all these debates, all these conversations. You can see like I had to resolve 192 conversations, and there are very many cases where you have different ideas and how you should implement something, or like it's tedious stuff. But in the end, when you do converge into the same goal, and when you do merge one PR, that feels really great. Also, your ideas are non-blocking. All these open source tools are more integrated than ever as well. So when I used to work in a startup, I wanted to get my idea across. How it used to be was that we have to find the right tools to do it, We have to go into developing our own tools to do it sometimes. And then that can be a blocker in your ideas sometimes. And then you lose your way through your ideas by sidetracking into different tools. But now that all of these open source tools are well integrated, you can really stick to your idea, get your product to the market, get your ideas pushed to different people, and just do whatever you want with it, right? And that has never been easier. And I think that's what makes open source really great. How about you? What do you think open source is?
Yeah, when I'm asked what I no, I say a lot of I and don't realize that's anti-Korean culture. So so thinking about open source and maybe do a kind of German engineering approach about what open source is, probably you would start off and look into the internet and look for some definition of open source. And probably the most popular definition, according to my view, is the definition of the open source initiative, the open source definition, they call it also this way. And I see also people nodding here, indicating that this is really popular and people already have seen it somewhere. And you have a number of important points here, which seem obvious, because we all know that how open source projects look like. For example, that the source code is available, that it's permitted to create derived works, that you have an open source project shouldn't discriminate users of the open source project, shouldn't discriminate particular person groups, or a company, for example, shouldn't be tied to a product, right? You can only use that software if you buy something else from us or something like that. But getting back actually to the original idea of dinner together, the thing is that this definition of the OSI isn't capturing one important thing. It's that we thing that open source projects show today, right? And the we thing that open source projects show today is that a lot of project work by the group that develops the open source software is accessible, and even external people can engage with it and can become part of the community. So it's not only that you see actually the slide order. It's not only that you see actually accessible repositories in the internet with web pages, that you have elaborated documentation. For example, at Canonical, we use the diataxis framework, which is a very structured way of providing documentation and obviously on the first hand creating it. We see a very elaborated ways of providing artifacts. Think about how open source projects provide artifacts today. It's not really that you have a web link where you can download the binary like in the old days. Nowadays, artifacts are integrated into platforms which facilitate package management, dependency management, and all these things. That all happens for free without engaging into any commercial subscription or all these things. All the things are available for free. Think of Maven, for example, for Java packages. Many open source projects have a public bug tracker where you can submit your suggestions or bugs if you have found some. And it goes even further, not only that many open source projects obviously have public forums where everyone can sign in, but open source projects in the recent past have already started to publish their Zoom meeting or any meeting tool, meeting invitation link. There is also Microsoft Teams, I've heard. So there are meeting invitation links on the web, and make meetings accessible for everyone. Make public online meetings where the project group meets and everyone can attend. So if you think about open source, you could also think about it's about distributed development. Many open source projects implement distributed software development. Distributed software development means geographically distributed. People sit somewhere in the world and come together. And it also means distributed in terms of organizational affiliation. Because we see many open source projects coming from where contributors come from different companies, right? And contribute also to that same open source projects. So open source is not only about this who can use the software as opposed to the OSI, referring to the OSI definition, but it's also some other angle is about the engineering attitude of providing a distributed collaborative environment for collaborating together on an open source project. And if you think about the point that we have different companies involved, the question arises, how does that work? Different companies contribute to one open source project. Actually, the open source community came out also with a solution for that. These are the contributor license agreements. The contributor license agreements create the legal foundation for letting an open source project publish open source code contributed by different organizations. If you are interested in this topic in particular, you can have a look at the link provided here to the contributor license agreement page as an example that we provide for our open source projects. And there is even more. Not only the contributor license agreements and publicly available infrastructure, open source projects also provide the contributor guidelines, which is a very important aspect for collaboration. Technically, you could think of contributor guidelines in terms of definition of done, but it's more than that. It's about the process, the processes which an open source project adapts or implements in order to work, right? It's the way an open source project works, and it's described in the contributor guidelines. And that also solves an important issue of distributed collaboration. If you're interested in that, also here's provided an example for contributor guidelines. And then we have the last thing, thinking about the dinner altogether. And that is also something which is obviously something I like as a product manager, as a canonical product manager for open source projects. It's about preparing the dinner, hosting the dinner, right? As today, open source projects, many open source projects have persons who care for organizing workshops, giving presentations, advocating for the product or for the open source projects, run podcasts, you have blog posts, you have UbuCon Korea, for example, obviously. People write on social media about their activities, like for UbuCon Korea, for example, and all these things. So open source has developed a lot more than just the definition of the open source by the OSI. And that altogether brings us to the view that open source is ready, right? Open source, if you think about it today, is ready for professional development in the industry. Open source nowadays is the professional place for developing in a distributed fashion. Different organizations and geographically distributed. And obviously our conclusion is that, especially in Korea, from our perspective, the we culture is a perfect fit for open source projects. And let's maybe use the day also to reflect a little bit on what does open source mean to you when we see all the different open source efforts today.
Right, and here we are today. And here we are as a whole community today, and we have a great talks about Windows subsystems for Linux. We have things about mods. I hope this place will provide a very good place for a contribution, collaboration, and commitment into open source. And I really hope that we all have a fruitful day together. And with that, welcome to UbuCon Korea, and welcome to open source. Thank you. We have a little time left for any questions you might have.
Or thoughts on this, or examples?
Wait, yes.
Should I speak from here? Sure. Okay. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I'm Ben from Thor Robotic. I want to ask if you have any memorable open source that you worked on before that you enjoyed.
The question was
Memorable open source repositories. Linux kernel, obviously. You mean like open source repositories which are done exceptionally well, or?
Just anything in there.
Well, everything that Canonical does is open source, and if I may, it's like a little company yet, but I think Rocks is like a method to have new, very chiseled images. So we have that going on as well. We also have Juju, which is a way to automate your cloud environments. These are also pretty impressive works by Canonical, and it's all open source as well. So I really advise that you can just go to github.com/canonical and just play around there. Thank you.
Thank you.
혹시 더 질문 없으신가요? 잠시만요.
감사합니다. I think it was to torture that you show the picture of the food in front of the presentation. How do you think of it?
You know, there is another thing going on in Germany, which is about fermented food. So in the past few years, Germans discovered this healthy food thing, and they discovered that fermented food in particular is very healthy, and that brings a lot of Germans to kimchi. So you can even find kimchi on local German markets, which is insane because it's quite far away. So yeah, Germans like this fermented food, and I'm kind of also impressed by that. I don't know. I mean, Koreans obviously have found that fermented food hundreds of years ago, and eat very healthy since the beginning, right? I mean, and if you consider all the side dishes, it's full of also very healthy things like vegetables and leaves and all these things. So I think it's very great. And actually, if I can make the statement here, I think it's such a pity that I see these Paris baguette things growing, because Korean food is so much healthier than this Western wheat thing that's going on. But yeah, for just a personal opinion, how I think about it.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, it was torture for it was too torture in the beginning.
Before I came here, I had one samgakkimbap, so I guess that's a you problem. Just kidding.
아직 시간이 조금 있는데 한 분 정도 더 받을 수 있을 것 같아요. 혹시 질문 있으신 분 계신가요? 잠시만요.
한국어로 질문해도
네네네.
네, 발표 잘 들었습니다. 모든 사람들이 오픈소스에 기여하고 싶어 하는데 사실 언어 장벽이라는 걸 무시할 수는 없거든요. 근데 오픈소스 커뮤니티에서 그런 영어권이 아닌 국가의 사람들이 오픈소스에 참여하기 위한 언어 장벽을 좀 무너뜨리기 위해서 어떤 활동을 할 수 있을지, 그리고 실제로 글로벌로 어떤 활동들을 하고 있는지가 좀 궁금합니다.
That is a very great question. The question was, language barrier can be sometimes a very difficult thing for many people, right? And if he was asking if there are any movements or anything being done about having more inclusive open source repositories for everyone.
Obviously, there are also other Asian countries which also provide a lot of open source in their native languages, and we from Europe see this kind of like, wow, what's going on here? It looks interesting, but even code comments are written in some Asian language. I think everyone is hoping for automated translation, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, I think in terms of Canonical, I think we do have some like translations on the web pages, but I'm not too sure about the code side. Maybe that's the thing that we should consider when moving forward. Thank you very much for the question.